All right. I have 1 o'clock on my clock. We'll give it another minute or so for folks to trickle in. Excited to see we seem to have a pretty good turnout here by my current count. Looks like we have about 41 participants. I was concerned it might be myself, Shreyas, and Kathleen talking to each other, so it's good that that's not the case. For any of you who are so inclined, feel free to turn your videos on, and then we'll get things kicked off here momentarily, and we will be starting by doing a quick poll of our participants to get a sense of who we have in the audience and where folks are coming from. So we have a poll that's up. It should be up in your right-hand menu there. And if folks can respond and submit their poll results or responses, we'll collect all those and get a good sense of who we have here joining us on the call today. And give folks a few minutes to get that poll completed. And while folks are working on the poll, I would like to just talk about a few things. One is just the goal of this session. The goal is really to get some potential new action items for the ESJ action plan update. And the ESJ action plan outlines action steps the CPUC intends to take to further principles of environmental and social justice. They're centered on 9 goals, like incorporating equity into decision-making, increasing access to programs and services, promoting workforce development opportunities, and ways to participate in CPUC processes. So with that, I do want to talk a little bit about participation in this breakout session. We do hope to make this as much of an interactive discussion as possible. So there are a few ways that folks can participate. One, if you would like to give a verbal comment or ask a question, if you look on the participant list next to your name, there should be a hand. And if you click the hand next to your name on the participant list, the event host will call your name, and then they will be able to unmute your line when it's your turn to speak, and you can speak. Please keep in mind that it seems like we have a fairly large group, so we may not all be able to get to everyone's comments and questions. However, the session is being recorded, and so we will definitely make sure we're gathering all those into the discussion and doing it as much as possible. If you'd like to make a written comment or ask a question, you can type your comments or questions into the chat box and send them, make sure to send them to all participants. We'll try to weave in as much of that from the discussion in the chat box as we can, and we have Kathleen here to help support with that. And then even if we can't bring your comments into the discussion in chat, like I said, we'll be recording your feedback, and so we'll make sure to incorporate that into the action plan update as appropriate. And then finally, if you would like to submit written comments via email, for example, if you want to further elaborate on a topic or further elaborate on some comments you may have made, feel free to email your thoughts to the following email address. That is esjactionplan@cpuc.ca.gov. And then lastly, just before we start, as a reminder, the session is being recorded, so we'll be able to save all the feedback and comments and be able to incorporate them, as I said, when and as appropriate. So with that, I see we have about 30-ish seconds. I don't know. I don't have the poll results. but if we can, at some point, I would like to see kind of who we have in the audience. That would be great. Looks like we have, from my list, 79 participants. It's fantastic. Welcome all. I will start off by just introducing myself. My name is Coco Tomasi, and I'm a program project supervisor with the Wildfire Safety Division at Cpuc. And the Wildfire Safety Division, I'll give you guys a little bit of a background before I pass it off to my co-facilitator, Shreyas, is a new division that was formed in response to AB 1054 that was passed back in 2019. And so we started as a brand new division at the Cpuc in January 2020, and we will be transferring to the Natural Resources Agency July 1st of this year as a new office, the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. And our division is responsible for a number of things. Primarily, we review and approve utility wildfire mitigation plans. We also oversee the processes for safety certificates, safety culture assessments, and executive compensation. So with that, I do want to turn it over just briefly to Shreyas to do a quick introduction, and then we'll get to kind of framing our discussion for today.
Thanks, Coco. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our session this afternoon. Great to see a lot of participation here. As Coco said, my name is Shreyas Jutkar. I'm with the California Workforce Development Board. And in my role there, my function is primarily to build relationships and partnerships with other state agencies to ensure that we're creating and supporting quality jobs and increase access to good jobs for disadvantaged populations as we transition to a zero emission energy and transportation system, and really in all the ways that we're addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation. And as some folks may know, the Workforce Development Board and the PUC have entered into a formal agreement, a memorandum of understanding to work together on these issues that we signed last fall. And the work is going to focus on a number of key industry sectors or climate change sectors, energy, transportation, broadly speaking, and within that, vegetation management, and really thinking about that interface of vegetation management and the energy systems or electricity systems is one of our priority areas of focus. So looking forward to the discussion today to hear folks' thoughts and ideas for what more we can do in the action plan specifically and in more specific program areas or proceedings, again, to address the workforce development component of vegetation management. And again, thinking within that, thinking mainly about how do we ensure that the jobs that are created or supported by the investments in wildfire safety result in good quality jobs for folks in the labor market, and that we're increasing access to those good jobs for folks who are often left behind by economic development or economic opportunities. So again, look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Chris. And so just want to make sure I was off mute. See, we got our poll results in. Looks like we have pretty good participation kind of across the board. I see representation from most groups identified here except for the labor industry, which is great to see such a broad group and diverse group of people joining. So welcome all. I would just like to start off the discussion before we get too deeply into anything else, as I do oftentimes in discussions with the topic of wildfire, is just to state wildfires are a natural part of the California ecosystem, and long before people inhabited this land, fires existed. And so one of the things that I always like to stress as kind of a backdrop and underpinning of all of our discussions on wildfire issues is, as the population continues to grow in the state, housing becomes less and less affordable, and additional development and growth in what are called wildland-urban interface, or oftentimes referred to as WUI areas, can be expected. And so these particular WUI areas are also the areas that are most susceptible to damage from wildfires. And as a backdrop to all of this discussion, I think it's important that we all think about and think through some of the following as we have these discussions. One is, as a society and a community, how do we learn to live with fire? And then more so, and on topic of this particular dialogue, how do we consider impacts to ESJ communities in the WUI as we kind of further our development and discussion throughout the topic and breakout session today? And so Shreyas kind of covered a little bit about the topic that he'll be able to focus in on a little more and guide the discussion around workforce development, specifically in the veg management space. One of the areas that I want to help kind of frame our discussion around is a little more high level and specific to utilities. And so in that regard, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cpuc Fire Threat Map. And I'm not sure how many of you, I know we have a pretty broad group of people, and so I will be covering a little bit of a history of the map itself. And for those of you who this is old hat, please bear with us. But like most mapping products, the Cpuc's Fire Threat Map, it was initially scoped and developed through a rulemaking proceeding with a fairly specific and narrow focus, and that was to identify areas prone to promulgating large catastrophic fires and areas that should be subject to increased safety regulation. And so when that map was originally adopted back in late 2017, early 2018, it was developed with a vision for a 10-year refresh cycle. Now, since its adoption, California has seen some of the worst fire seasons in the state's history, and several of those fires have involved utility facilities. And those devastating catastrophic events have really spurred a lot of action in response to deal with this seemingly kind of ever-growing threat in the state. And so a lot of those actions are also things that are taken on by California electric utilities. And so in the space of what we do in the Wildfire Safety Division, and I had mentioned earlier with wildfire mitigation plans, we've seen in, for example, the 2020 wildfire mitigation plans, utilities outline spending billions of dollars in responding to managing the wildfire risks. Utilities are deploying a variety of strategies to mitigate these risks. Those span from operational to tactical and structural efforts, including things like broad use of PSPS, increased vegetation management activities, extensive grid hardening, things like installing covered conductors, undergrounding, replacement of existing infrastructure, expanded situational awareness capabilities. Those include things like broader deployment of weather stations, grid sensoring and monitoring devices, and so forth. And so the reason I wanted to talk a little bit today about the map and the Cpuc Fire Threat Map is that it's that map which underpins many aspects of utility wildfire safety decision-making and operations, from identifying areas or potential areas for grid hardening or additional inspections, to where veg management occurs, to where PSPS may occur. And so it is a really important tool and aspect. And really the main question that I want to think about as we have the discussion today and we get into some more detail is, as use of the map continues to evolve and we evaluate whether or how the map should be refined or updated, how can we ensure that we take ESJ considerations into those updates and those changes as we move forward? And so that to me is really kind of where I'd like to start as far as framing the discussion. And Shreyas, I want to pass it back to you. I don't know if there's any additional context you want to provide relative to framing the workforce development issues pertaining to veg management. And if there aren't, I'm happy to kind of start diving into some of the topics and questions and stir up some discussion.
I think why don't we go ahead to discussion on the fire threat map and other issues, and then I'll say a little bit more before we jump to the workforce development discussion. That sounds okay.
Awesome, works for me. So really a few things I want to think through when we talk about the Cpuc Fire Threat Map. As I mentioned, the map was really initially built with a pretty focused and narrow scope. At that time, the use of, for example, something like PSPS as a mitigation strategy was not as prevalent as it is today. And so as the map expands kind of beyond its initial scope and is subject to future updates, which it is through both the Wildfire Mitigation Plan, there's a specific statutory element where utilities have to evaluate the sufficiency of that map, as well as there's an open proceeding right now before the Commission to make some updates to the existing areas relative to a petition filed by Southern California Edison. And so as those updates are being undertaken, the first question I have, or series of questions I have, is are there scenarios or use cases where it may make sense to have variations of this map developed for specific intended use cases? And if so, what are those scenarios and use cases? How can those maps consider different ESJ factors like demographics, societal costs, and so forth? And what factors should be considered? And then finally, what types of tools and source information should be used to inform these ESJ factors? For example, something like CalEnviroScreen, and where would these types of tools best fit? And so I know I threw a series of questions, but it's really intended to start getting people thinking and discussing around how can we start considering various ESJ factors into potentially adding additional layers of context to an existing map or developing potentially additional mapping products. And so I'm very curious to see or hear from folks in the audience kind of thoughts on this particular issue. So for our monitor, I don't know if people have raised hands, or Kathleen, I haven't been monitoring the chat, but if anything's come up in the chat, I really want to turn it over to the group to answer or provide any thoughts or context relative to the questions laid out regarding adding or how additional environmental and social justice issues can be potentially taken up in the context of refining or modifying existing map products. Not all at once.
Coco, you got one raised hand. William Abrams.
Oh, hey, Will.
Hey, Coco. Thanks very much for that introduction and overview. I think the map is critically important to how we proceed, but I think some of the areas where it could be adapted are really related to the objectives of the Commission. So as an example, if we had, as part of the objective is to look at prevention, then the map might look very different. And so sort of outlining what the goals are for the map beyond the current use of the map, I think would help inform its direction. The other thing that I think is really important for this map as we think about how it relates to overall collaboration across agencies is really how it integrates with other maps. So as an example, we have community wildfire protection plans, or CWPPs, and they exist across the state at lots of different levels, city level, county level, more broad, even specific to a particular neighborhood. So, I think having that map relate somehow to what those other plans are is a great place to start. Here in Santa Rosa, we have, I think upwards of 30 plus different fire departments, and sort of understanding how that look interacts with what we're doing with this map, I think is really important. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Will. Appreciate the comments and thoughts. We get any other takers, Kathleen? I'm scrolling through quickly myself. Not seeing any. Okay. Oh, see a hand raised. Chris. Oh, Chris.
Hey, Coco. Hi. Yeah, just another comment to go off to Will's comment is one of the issues we see around other programs, such as, say, SGIP or something, when the fire threat maps are used for eligibility. It just, they tend to become the default. So I don't, either that has to be incorporated into the fire threat map process, looking at how they interface with other programs, or we need to develop other maps for those programs.
Thanks for that comment, Chris. And that's a great example, right? So, for example, like the SCHIP program. And the intent of the fire threat map is intended to be somewhat of an agnostic scientific map that is outlining where the wildfire risks are. But I think as we go down the path of thinking around how does that map then get incorporated into other types of decision making, whether it be SGIP, whether it be PSPS or other types of issues, what are additional kind of contextual layers or overlays that can be placed on top of that map to better refine and scope and take into account other characteristics or features or issues that the map itself isn't designed to take into account. And I appreciate the comments from Will and Chris. It looks like that's stirred some additional hands to be raised. I see a couple on my screen here. Maybe first Richard Scaff, and then Mary Rose. Richard, you may be double muted. No, Richard, it's unfortunately, I don't think your audio is coming through for whatever reason. Maybe we can try to go with Mary Rose, and Richard, if you could maybe type in your comment into the chat. Sorry about that.
Hi, everybody. This is Mary Rose Turuk. I'm with the Reclaim Our Power Utility Justice Campaign. You've probably heard us at public comments sessions during different CPUC meetings. So the Reclaim Our Power campaign works with a lot of folks who have survived fires and shutoffs, and including folks from the disability justice community. And so I want to echo a little bit about what Will said about what are the goals of these maps. And, wildfire safety, around safety, like what kinds of safety goals do we have? And so if we frame it in that way, the things that we're seeing around safety are both like the vulnerable populations, right? So including, so for instance, even within the vulnerable populations, medically vulnerable groups or households. We've seen and we've studied, actually some of our researchers from the Institute for Energy Justice has looked into, do the utilities like PG&E know where the vulnerable, medically vulnerable households are? And the answer generally is no, not really. Even though they have some medical baseline customers that they've identified, there's still largely folks who are not in that list or program. And so we need to be able to get to those folks if safety, especially around electricity, continuous electricity during shutoffs or evacuations, that we have those lists and maps of where they are so that they can have the information to keep them safe. There's also safety for those who have already experienced fires and the effects of that. What about, for instance, the farm worker community in the Sonoma-Napa area? So we work with groups on the ground there who have a whole huge task of trying to recover from previous fires, much less the threat of oncoming ones. So what is the safety plan and mapping for making sure that farm workers and the farm worker community are safe and are being helped from the effects that they've already been exposed to? And then wildfire safety in terms of just like the overall energy system. We're like, how can the public, Reclaim Our Power is trying to make sure that we have more community and frontline community and worker control of our energy system, and certainly away from PG&E, because PG&E has been known to burn us down. And so how are we moving towards more community and worker control and ability to take care of our communities? So how are we tracking where PG&E, for instance, is failing us, and the accountability measure within the CPUC and the plan of reorganization that was put in place? Like, where is that tracking happening? And is the Wildfire Safety Division the group that is doing that through maps or this program? So I'll stick with those three for now. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks for those comments, Mary Rose. And I think, you brought up some really good points, especially around a couple of particular areas that I know of are of high importance, specifically around medically vulnerable groups. And one of my thoughts on this particular issue is ultimately, and this is kind of where I think it would be useful to have some additional thought and dialogue, and I don't want to spill too much into Shreyas's time. How do we get the right people involved in the right proceedings, in the right processes, where these types of discussions are taking place? Because I think across the board, I haven't met anyone who disagrees that identifying where medically vulnerable people are is an important thing, especially as it relates to not just utility work and PSPS and other things, but just in general, and what are the proper data sources? Where is that information obtained? What CBOs can utilities work with? How can we get these types of people involved in the various proceedings we have going forward before the commission, so that we can really spur and get this type of input? Because I think it's highly, highly important to make sure we have the right people in the room, having the right types of discussions, and adding the right context, because oftentimes, as happens, and those of you who have participated in a lot of our proceedings, we don't always get a really broad spectrum of participation from a lot of different groups. And so how, and I really want us to think through that, how can we as an agency, as a CPUC, better reach out and attract and get people on board? One thing that has always been a bit of a surprise to me is how few people are really well aware of certain programs and things we have, like Intervenor Compensation, where we actually compensate interveners for getting involved and making substantial contributions to our decision-making processes. The agency, by design, is intended to solicit input from the public, from certain community-based organizations, stakeholder groups. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been a challenge for me as staff working up through the commission almost for the past decade is how do we attract and get the right people into these settings to be able to provide some of the input from an organization like Reclaim Our Power that Mary Rose is mentioning, or through the various groups that get involved in, for example, SJIP that Chris mentioned. And so to me, those are some of the issues that I think, and I would be willing, and I know at some point I got to turn it back to Shreyas because we're fast running out of time, and I want to allow him an opportunity, but I would love to, if folks have thoughts on any of these questions that I raised, especially around soliciting and engaging more entities to get involved and participate in proceedings and efforts we have going on. I would welcome that to be submitted via chat or an email to the inbox that I had mentioned earlier, which I will also drop in the chat box. I'm going to, for 1 second, try to turn it back over to Richard. I feel bad that we weren't able to get to your comment, Richard. So if you can speak up, feel free. Otherwise, if we can't hear you, I want to turn it over to Shreyas to get into the veg management portion of the discussion. You know, your audio still seems like it's not coming through. But really sorry about that, Richard. Feel free to drop it in the chat and or send it via email. We'll make sure your comments get incorporated into the final discussion. With that, I do want to turn it over to Shreyas to kick us off into kind of the next wing or lever of our discussion here as it pertains to veg management.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to just offer a few more comments to kind of frame the discussion, and then I'll set out with some questions or sort of discussion prompts. And of course, feel free to chime in with input, feedback, comments on anything related to workforce development and vegetation management that I may not cover. So to start with, I think I'll give a quick overview of the industry and the workforce as we see it at the State Workforce Development Board. This is, vegetation management and the interface with our utility systems. This is an emerging and expanding area of work. There's just more work to be done and more types of work to be done to make sure that we're addressing public safety, worker safety, and of course addressing still the reliability of the electricity system, and without a doubt addressing climate change. So a lot of factors that are expanding this area of work, and with that should be an expansion of employment opportunities, of course. At the same time, before we just start thinking, before we jump to figuring out, well, how do we get more people involved in this sector, in this industry? Because of course we hear, and I'm sure many folks here hear similar things or share the same comments that there's not enough qualified workers to get the job done. So before we just jump to training and thinking about pathways to jobs, I think it's important to say a little bit more about the industry, and specifically, what we see here is a lot of contractors with the utilities who are engaged in this work, and major challenges and problems in terms of the quality of the jobs and access to jobs. To say a little bit more about that, in this industry, there's and I'm talking about Now, forestry services as an industry sector overall, and vegetation management is a piece of that. In the forestry services sector, there's a reliance on foreign guest workers to do the work. And for a variety of reasons, not excluding that population, there is very low pay, very grueling and hazardous working conditions. And given the nature of the work, there's challenges for actually enforcing labor law in this sector. And turning to job access, with a lot of contractors and this being still a somewhat emerging area of work, we don't really have a very standardized set of skills or training to make sure that number one, the work is performed well, and number two, that there are clear pathways to the jobs in this sector. And so I'll turn for a second to what I think is sort of beginning to change this sort of industry landscape, both policies and programs. One state law that was passed in 2019, Senate Bill 247, addresses a very specific aspect of this vegetation management work, tree trimming and around utility lines. And that state law, Senate Bill 247, it first of all requires that a qualified workforce perform this work doing utility line clearance. It sets a wage standard, a prevailing wage determination for those qualified workers. And so here you begin to start to see the beginning of some real policy tools to address both job quality and job access. And of course, immediately following the fact that we do have now at least sort of a definition of what a qualified utility line clearance tree trimmer is, now we need to start thinking about what are the training programs to make sure that we have those qualified workers. And I'll just mention very quickly that the Workforce Board is investing in one such training program, and there are, of course, many others, I'm sure, out in the field. But very quickly, I want to say that through our High Road Training Partnership Program, we're investing in a new effort with the Electrical Workers Union, some community colleges, utilities, namely PG&E, and some community groups, to start actually developing an 18 to 24 month training program that leverages the Electrical Workers Apprenticeship Program. There's a lot more we could say about that, but for today's conversation, I just want to leave it that, again, this is important for two reasons. Number one, the state law and these programs that are being developed, this is about addressing the quality of the jobs, making sure that, again, there's a decent wage and benefit standard, that there's investment in training from employers. And with that comes a more clearly defined and transparent training pathway to these jobs. And I don't want to claim that this is, a silver bullet or a magical answer to all of the challenges. But again, I think we're starting to see the beginning of that in this space. And so I think for the group today, I think the main questions to help guide our discussion are the following. Number one, how should the ESJ action plan address vegetation management and address this growing area of work? Two, how can we help ensure what more can be done to help ensure that there's a skilled and diverse labor force, as well as a responsible contractor pool as this industry continues to grow? And then lastly, what standards or mandates or incentives or other kinds of resources are needed? So I'll leave it there and look forward to folks' input on those questions. And again, if that doesn't capture your thoughts and ideas or comments, please feel free to chime in with anything, again, related to workforce development and vegetation management. And let's see, I'll open up the chat here real quick. Oh, some long comments. So give me 1 second to look through this. And maybe as I do that, sorry, Kathleen, is it you that might be able to see if there's anyone who's raised their hand?
Yeah,
Or...
so I did just want to do one question before we get back to Will. We have one question from Alexandra. Where can I find more information on the Ibew Community Colleges training program?
Yeah, we will, you know, I'm happy to provide my email address, and I can provide just a summary of the program. Let me also mention that we have just awarded the funding, so the contracting is still to be done, and I believe it'll still be a little bit of time until the training program is actually up and running. And once that happens, then I think we'll be able to have a specific contact that we can point people to that may be interested in signing up for that training program. So I'll put my email in the chat, and would be happy to share, you know, just again, a little bit of a program summary of what's being developed with folks. So let me do that now.
All right, so now we've got Will, followed by Carl. Maybe Will go first.
Thanks very much. On the subject of sort of encouraging workforce development in vegetation management, of course, broadly across the state, that's a real need. I would just, I guess, caution as it relates to the work of the utilities, that this does not supplant or distract from the utilities' responsibility to do vegetation management around their lines. So to the extent that this program is being used in relation to supporting the utilities, I think it's really important that it be driven by the utilities so that they maintain responsibility for that. As we know, there's been you know, a lot of effort recently to move the liability associated with that from the utilities to these very small, much smaller contractors that are in charge of doing the vegetation management. And I would just really caution that this not be inadvertently leveraged for that type of direction. I did want to make a few other comments in relations to environmental and social justice more broadly in regards to wildfire mitigation. One of which is, you know, I think the poll that was put up here was very telling. You know, 2-to-1 in terms of the other folks that are outside of the CPUC. There are utilities being represented here. And I think, you know, if you looked at the amount of resources, right, that are behind that, you know, it's probably 100 or 1,000 to 1 in terms of that representation, which makes sense, right? Because those are the folks who are being regulated, and those are the folks who have the resources and the means during a workday to show up to a discussion like that. So that makes sense. But I think that really puts the impetus really upon the CPUC to what Coco mentioned earlier, which is really finding ways to make sure that other voices are represented. And I think being very clear in the CPUC, being very clear about how input is leveraged, how a public comment for 2 minutes at the podium is leveraged, how is that quantified, how does that make its way to a commissioner's ruling, how does a public comment posted on the website make its way for real consideration, and what are those criteria for which that comment will be considered so that individuals from the public know where to insert themselves and how that really will be substantive, more substantively looked at. The other area, I think, in terms of wildfire related social environmental justice is really around making sure that you have the voices at the table, particularly around wildfire survivors, right? So there's a number of different proceedings that stretch across the commission where different groups are sort of de facto representing wildfire survivors. Perhaps that's because they have some financial stake in another proceeding, whether that be in Allsup's court or through the bankruptcy or elsewhere, the PG&E bankruptcy or elsewhere, that sort of de facto are you know, at the CPUC trying to represent those interests for for effect on those other matters. And so I think it's going to be really important as you look at wildfire issues in general at the CPUC that you're really making sure that that the organizations that are engaging in those matters, that we understand sort of what they represent and what they don't represent, and that we make sure that we're doing that outreach to make sure that other voices are at the table. And just last very quick point is that public participation hearings should be incorporated into every single proceeding in some way or another, so that we start to hear those voices. We aren't going to be able to get the type of social justice, environmental justice that we want without really reaching out in that way, in a very deliberate way, to the public. I know there are all sorts of limits to that, but there are ways to do it in a streamlined way and in a prescriptive way to get the type of input that the public utilities are looking for, and I would encourage you to do so. That's it. Sorry to ramble on. Thank you.
All right, Coco, should I ask any comments, or should we move to the next one?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. So thanks for the comments, and I think if I heard your comments, Will, correctly, you know, the training program and, you know, addressing the contractors out in the field is not meant in any way to you know, let the utilities off the hook or minimize their responsibility here. And I believe I neglected to mention at the outset that what we know about this industry is that a good chunk of the work is done by utility employees, and a lot of it is also done by a contracted workforce. And it's really the lack of organization of that contracted workforce that we're trying to address, at least in part, through both I think the state law that I mentioned, as well as the training program. So, you know, and I don't know that there's more I can say at this moment in terms of like what that means for utilities' responsibility. I think we'll need to dig into that a little bit more, and perhaps as time goes on, not to just say that we should wait for a problem to arise. I certainly don't mean that, but just to say your point is well taken, and again, not to discount the work that's done by utility employees and the need for the utilities to still be in that role. And then to turn to, I think, what Mary Rose had mentioned around worker control, just a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, that, you know, this is absolutely, you know, worker voice and worker wisdom in the decision making of these industries is an essential component for the workforce development board's programs. It is an essential element of the types of training partnerships that we fund. And the way we operationalize that is we only really fund training partnerships that include both employers and workers and their representatives, namely unions, wherever feasible. And there are many other groups that should be part of those training partnerships as well. But, you know, that I think is just to speak a little bit to sort of the way that we're trying to address workforce development to make sure we're addressing economic equity. And again, worker voice is an essential element of that. And then so I think that kind of speaks to the program or the project that we're funding. And of course, you know, I don't know all the details of the collective bargaining agreement between the utilities and their workers, but that is also a place where certainly these issues of, you know, being part of the decision-making process could and should be addressed if they're not already. But I don't know enough about that to say if and how that's already part of this, but definitely appreciate the comment about worker control and making sure that the folks who are on the front lines and engaged in this work are bringing their knowledge and expertise to the decisions that are made around wildfire safety. So I'll stop there. I think you said, is Carl, he's the next one up?
Yeah, I'm Carl Wilmson with the Northwest Forest Worker Center. Thanks, Shreyas, for bringing up the contracting workforce and all your comments around the problems there. You're absolutely right. There's a very high job-related injury, illness, and fatality rate in the forestry services industry, and very little safety training. Most contractors, even though they're required by state law to train their workers, they don't. The type of training, what passes for training is a new worker gets hired and he's paired with another worker who's more experienced, and he spends a couple of days with that worker and that worker shows him what to do. That's what passes for safety training. So I'm very pleased to hear about your work on the safety training component. And as you mentioned, also a big problem is lack of enforcement. There are a variety of reasons for that. But one idea to help ensure that the workers do get safety training is to implement or create a requirement that contractors must demonstrate that their workers have received adequate safety training before they can enter into state contracts. And that's something that's already done for wildland firefighters. They have to show their red card before they can work on federal Forest Service firefighting contracts.
Thanks, Carl. And for the sake of time, we'll move on to others, but would definitely love to follow up with you or encourage you to share comments to get into more specifics of what that looks like in other sectors that could be replicated here. And of course, there may be gaps, and in what already exists. And as much as possible, I think we'd love to figure out the how. And so appreciate those comments and your experience, of course, in this sector.
Yes, I'd like to echo that. Thanks for those comments. I've been trying to scroll through the chat while some of the discussion was taking place. It seems several people were having issues getting on the WebEx, and that was causing a lot of delays. I think that should definitely be accounted for, and I know we'll be cataloging the chat and the discussion, so I appreciate folks' feedback there, and we'll certainly circle that back to Monica and the team. With that being said, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Kathleen, I wanted to provide an opportunity if you could potentially quickly maybe summarize and read out any takeaways or potential action items that you heard through the discussion today.
Sure. All right. So we did hear that we should be looking at how things kind of back to the high fire threat district map layer. We should be looking at how that map relates to the universe of, the world of other maps in the wildfire space. Think about how this map gets incorporated into decision-making like PSPS, SJIP. What are the contextual layers or overlays that could be placed on top of that map to take into account other uses? We heard that we need to be thinking through what are the goals of these maps. For example, do the utilities know where the medical baseline customers are? How do we incorporate information to keep those folks safe? And then also developing some kind of accountability measure within the PUC to track where progress is happening. How do we use maps for that? And also, how do we get the right people in place? This has kind of showed up in both discussions around workforce and maps. How do we get the right people involved in the proceedings where these discussions are happening so that we get the right stakeholders in the room, we get a broad spectrum of folks and voices. And then also something that came up in the workforce specifically was talking about like training, safety training, and having people be able to show some kind of certificate or something before entering into a contract. Is there anything else I was missing, Coco, Shreyas?
No, the one caveat that I do just want to mention in regards to identification, there's I want to make sure we distinguish between medical baseline customers, which is a program that people elect to get into for the utilities, and medically vulnerable populations, which is likely a much broader subset of individuals. And unfortunately, 55 minutes is not enough time for us to significantly provide all of these various topics their due process and time to discuss. With that being said, first off, I want to thank everyone for their participation. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Secondly, I just want to reiterate that all the comments we receive and feedback through this discussion, as well as anything that we get in response to the email inbox that I provided in the chat earlier, that's esjactionplan@cpuc.ca.gov. Those will all be considered, and the CPUC intends to release a draft of the updated plan later this spring and is going to allow for additional public comment at that time. And so I would encourage folks to remain engaged, and my personal sincerest apologies for those that were having difficulty logging on and getting access. I think those are things that definitely need to be taken into consideration as we as an agency start looking at our public participation processes and the tools we use to do that. And then in the meantime, if anyone has any additional comments to make that you weren't able to make in the chat or speak up during this call, please make sure to send those over to that ESJ action plan at cpuc.ca.gov inbox. And with that, I do want to thank everyone for your time and participation today. Hopeful to continue these dialogues as we move forward in the future and have more engagement from interested stakeholders like yourselves. Any parting words, Shreyas?
I'll just echo the appreciation for folks participating in our session and offering input, and of course, welcome comments, input, conversations outside of this forum as well. And I've provided my email for folks who are interested in the workforce development aspect specifically. And maybe lastly, I'll just flag that before folks go, if you're interested, there's a couple of comments in the chat that provide a little bit more information around workforce development. Alan from the Air Resources Board mentioned some training programs at community colleges around the state. And my coworker, Zach, at the Workforce Board provided a link to a major report we submitted to the legislature last fall that has a chapter dedicated to the natural and working lands climate change sector, in which these issues are discussed there. So for folks who are interested in geeking out a little bit more on the industry and some of the job quality and job access challenges, that's a great piece of material to reference. So, and also know that that's sort of partly our basis for the conversations we'll be having with the PUC in our formal agreement to, again, help address workforce development and make sure that we're not just thinking about the training, but making sure that, again, we're addressing all the labor and workforce aspects. And maybe just to close, I'll say that while the workforce development and our vision of that is, of course, worker-centric, it is absolutely in the industry's, I think, best interest to address these challenges. It improves productivity, it'll reduce turnover, major issues, I'm sure, in this industry. And of course, it's an imperative for making sure quality work is performed so that we actually meet our environmental and public health, public safety outcomes from this work as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. And I believe the main session is picking back up at 2 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. So hope to the rest of you get to join that. And thanks again for all your participation, and look forward to continued dialogue and engagement. Bye.
Thank you.